There are moments in life that don't announce themselves. They don't come with fanfare or warning. They don't send you a letter in the morning telling you that by the afternoon, everything you thought you understood about a place or a person is going to shift. That Tuesday morning started exactly like that. Quiet, ordinary, the kind of morning that makes you feel like nothing important will ever happen again. My name is Marcus Holt. I've worked as a documentary researcher for almost 11 years now. I've been inside palaces. I've walked corridors that most people only ever see in photographs. I've spoken to footmen who served 3 monarchs and gardeners who planted roses that were never meant for public eyes. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened the morning I accompanied Sergeant Edmund Rowe to Rayfield House. That's what we'll call the estate in this account, Rayfield House. A private residence connected to the late Queen's personal collection, not Windsor, not Balmoral, something smaller, something that the press had never properly catalogued and that most of the palace's own administrative staff didn't think about unless they absolutely had to. I'm telling you this up front because what happened there deserves honesty. It deserves the kind of telling that doesn't clean itself up for comfort. So I'm going to tell it the way it happened. The morning was gray. Not dramatically gray, not the kind of gray you'd put in a film to signal something ominous is coming. It was just flat, English October gray, the kind that sits on rooftops like a damp cloth and doesn't lift until well past noon. Edmund picked me up at 7:30. He was already in uniform, not the ceremonial scarlet, but the working blues that senior protection officers wear when they're doing actual operational work. He had a flask of tea in one hand and a folder tucked under his arm. He didn't smile when I got in the car, but Edmund rarely smiled before 9. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the folder. I'd worked with Edmund on 3 previous documentary projects. He was careful, meticulous. He never brought physical paperwork to a field visit unless it was strictly necessary. He preferred encrypted tablets and radio communication. Paperwork, he'd once told me, leaves a trail that nobody thinks about until they need to. So the folder bothered me. I didn't ask about it immediately. We drove for about 40 minutes through suburban roads that gradually gave way to narrower lanes, hedgerows pressing in on both sides, the kind of English countryside that looks painted rather than real. Edmund was quiet. The radio was off. The only sounds were the engine and occasionally the distant call of something in the fields we passed. It was only when he turned down a private access road, unmarked, gated with a stone pillar on each side that looked older than living memory, that he finally spoke. "I need you to understand something before we go in," he said. "What you see today doesn't leave this car until I tell you it can." I looked at him. "Edmund, I'm a documentary researcher. I'm here because you invited me. What exactly are we walking into?" He paused, not a dramatic pause. More the kind of pause that someone makes when they're choosing their words because the wrong ones would cause the wrong impression. "The late Queen," he said finally, "kept things here that no one was supposed to find yet. Rayfield House wasn't grand. That's the first thing that struck me when we pulled through the gate and I saw it properly for the first time. I had imagined something imposing, tall windows, a long front drive, the kind of estate that announces its own importance from 200 yards away. This was not that. It was a Georgian house, yes, but modest by royal standards. 2 stories, pale stone that had gone a little greenish with age and lichen. 6 windows across the front, a simple door with a small iron knocker. The grounds around it were well kept but not showy, more like a working farm garden than an ornamental landscape. There was an old wisteria along the east wall, bare in October, its branches like gray wire against the stone. A Land Rover was already parked near the side entrance. And beside it, standing perfectly still in a way that immediately marked him as someone trained to stand still, was another man. Edmund parked. We got out. The air smelled of wet grass and something woody, pine resin, maybe, or old stone. Cold in the way that October mornings in England are cold, which is not violently cold, but the kind that settles inside your collar and doesn't leave. "Marcus," said Edmund, "this is Warrant Officer James Calloway. He's the reason we're here." Calloway was perhaps 50, not tall but solid, the kind of build that comes from decades of physical discipline rather than deliberate gym work. His hair was cut short and going gray at the temples. His face was calm in the way that some faces are calm because they've learned that calm is necessary, not because they feel it naturally. He shook my hand once firm and didn't say anything beyond a nod. "James found something 3 weeks ago," Edmund said. "We've been verifying it. Today is the first time an outside party is coming in." Inside, Rayfield House smelled of old wood and something faintly floral. Dried flowers, perhaps. There were several arrangements in the corridor that had clearly been left to dry rather than removed. The hallway was narrow, with oak paneling that had darkened with age and a stone floor with a runner of faded carpet down the middle. Nothing flashy. Nothing that said royal property in the way you'd expect. What it said, instead, was private. Every single thing in that hallway had been chosen by someone who didn't expect visitors. The small watercolor near the coat hooks, not a significant work, just a pleasant country scene, slightly crooked. The Wellington boots lined up near the back door in order of size. The wooden tray on the side table with a single pen and a few folded letters. It felt like walking into someone's home. Not a palace, not an institution, a home. Calloway led us through the ground floor without speaking much. Edmund walked beside me and occasionally said something quietly. The house had been used periodically for decades, managed by a small trust attached to the royal household, not publicly listed as a royal property in any inventory that the press had access to. We reached a door near the back of the house. Solid wood, older than the rest of the interior, with iron hardware that looked original to the building. Calloway unlocked it with a key from his breast pocket. Not a modern key, a proper old iron key, the kind that belongs in a story. The door opened onto a staircase going down. Not a grand staircase. A narrow, practical staircase, stone steps worn smooth in the center, with a rope banister on one side and bare stone wall on the other. Below, a single electric light, clearly added decades after the house was built, gave off a yellowish glow. "Watch your step," said Calloway. It was the first complete sentence he'd said since we arrived. The room below wasn't a cellar in any dramatic sense. It was low-ceilinged and long, running nearly the full length of the house. The walls were stone, lined with wooden shelving. There was a large wooden table in the center, scarred with decades of use, with 2 modern portable lights set up at either end, the kind conservators use when they need precise, even illumination. And on that table, and on those shelves, and in the carefully arranged boxes on the floor, were things that made me stop in the doorway. I'm not an antiques expert. I'm not a royal historian or an archivist. But I've spent 11 years working around institutions, and I've developed a sense, the way anyone does over time, for when something in front of you matters. The objects in that room mattered. There were boxes of correspondence, letters, dozens of them, in a handwriting I would later be told was the late Queen's own. There were small personal items, a locket on a chain, coiled carefully in a cloth, a pair of gloves, pale, folded once, what appeared to be a prayer book leather-bound with a ribbon marker faded to near white. A small painted portrait, perhaps 8 inches by 10, depicting a young woman I didn't immediately recognize. There were objects that clearly had historical significance. A medal in a velvet case, a section of embroidered fabric pinned flat, a small carved box that looked, and I would later learn this was correct, like it dated from the late 18th century. And there were things that were simply personal. A child's drawing mounted on card, a folded program from what appeared to be a theater performance, a handful of pressed flowers behind glass, a small photograph in a plain frame, not the formal portrait kind, but the candid kind, the kind taken without a subject knowing, catching someone mid-laugh. I stood there for what must have been a full 30 seconds without saying anything. "How long has this been here?" I finally asked. Calloway was the one who answered. "Best estimate based on what we've verified so far, at least 30 years, some of it considerably longer. I want to tell you what it felt like to stand in that room. Because facts alone don't carry it. It felt like stumbling into someone's most private thought, like opening a drawer that you weren't supposed to open, not because something terrible was inside, but because what was inside was too real, too human, too honest for the public version of the person to accommodate. The late Queen was, and this is not an original observation, one of the most publicly scrutinized human beings in modern history. Every expression she made was documented, every outfit cataloged, every handshake photographed from 11 different angles. She lived her entire adult life in a glass case, observed constantly, interpreted endlessly, made into a symbol before she had the chance to simply be a person. And here, in a stone room beneath a modest Georgian house, was the part that had not been made into a symbol. The part she had kept. The part she had chosen. Edmund was watching me. He understood. I could see it in the way he let the silence run, that the moment needed to be felt before it was processed. She came here, I said. It wasn't quite a question. Occasionally, said Calloway. Not often, but yes. The story of how Calloway found this room is, in its own way, remarkable. He had been assigned to the property as part of a periodic security assessment, a routine review of lesser-known royal properties that takes place every several years. His task was largely administrative. Check the structural integrity of the building, verify that the security systems were functioning, document anything that needed attention. The locked door near the back of the house had been logged in a previous assessment as a locked storage area, contents unspecified. Calloway had requested the key from the estate management office. It had taken 3 weeks to locate, because the key had been filed under a reference number that corresponded to a different property. A clerical error from, it appeared, sometime in the early 1990s. When he finally got the key, he'd come down the stairs expecting boxes of old furniture or archived administrative records, the kind of institutional accumulation that tends to pile up in old buildings. What he found instead was this. He had stood in the room for a long time, he told me, before touching anything. He's that kind of man, careful, instinctive about procedure, trained to assess before he acts. Then he had gone back upstairs, sat down in the house's small kitchen, made himself a cup of tea, and thought very carefully about what he was going to do next. I knew it mattered, he said. I just needed to be clear in my own mind about what mattered most, the things downstairs or the protocol. He paused. I decided the things downstairs had to come first, but the protocol had to be respected on the way there. So he had called Edmund, because Edmund was someone he trusted completely. And together, over the following 3 weeks, they had done what needed to be done: careful documentation, preliminary verification, consultation with the right people, before anyone else was brought in. Including me. By mid-morning, I had been in that room for nearly 3 hours. Calloway had walked me through what they'd cataloged so far. Edmund had explained the verification process. I had asked questions and written notes, and sat very still with some of the items and not touched them, just looked, because some things deserve to be looked at before they are discussed. Near the back of the room, on a lower shelf, wrapped carefully in acid-free tissue that looked considerably newer than the objects around it, was something Calloway had saved for last. He brought it to the table, unwrapped it slowly, with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. It was a wooden box, small, perhaps 12 inches long and 8 wide. Dark wood, polished once but now softly matte with age. On the lid, in what I could see had once been gilded lettering now faded to a pale ghost, were initials. Not the late Queen's initials. Older ones. We've had preliminary verification, Calloway said. We believe this belonged to Queen Mary, the late Queen's grandmother. I looked at it. She kept it, I said. For decades, he said. In her own private space, not in any formal collection, not in any inventory, she kept it here. There was a long silence. Outside, somewhere above us, I could hear the wind moving against the house. That tells you something, I said. Yes, said Calloway very quietly. It does. We stayed until early afternoon. When we came back upstairs, the flat gray morning had shifted to the kind of pale, watery October light that makes everything look like it's being seen through gauze. I stood in the doorway of Rayfield House and looked out at the grounds, the bare wisteria, the wet grass, the stone pillars at the gate where we'd entered, and tried to put words around what I was feeling. I couldn't quite. Edmund locked the back door. Calloway stood for a moment in the hallway, looking at nothing in particular, and then he straightened slightly, the small, unconscious adjustment of a man who has spent his career learning to hold himself steady, and went to retrieve his jacket from the hook by the front door. What happens to it all now? I asked Edmund. He looked at me for a moment. The right people have been informed, the right process has begun, it'll go where it should go. Which is? He half smiled. The first real expression I'd seen from him all morning. Somewhere it's properly cared for, and eventually, when everything is in order, somewhere people can understand it. The public. Eventually, he said, yes. I thought about the pressed flowers, the child's drawing on card, the photograph of someone laughing caught unaware in a plain frame. She didn't want those things to be a symbol, I said. Edmund didn't answer immediately. He picked up his folder from the side table, tucked it back under his arm. No, he said, I don't think she did. He paused at the front door. But perhaps that's exactly why they matter. We didn't talk much on the drive back. Edmund kept his eyes on the road. I kept mine on the window, the hedgerows, the gray sky, the occasional farmhouse half visible through bare trees. My notebook was open on my knee, but I hadn't written anything since we'd left. Some things resist the immediate act of putting them down. They need to settle first. It wasn't until we were back in the city, hitting the first real traffic, that Edmund spoke. I need you to come back tomorrow. I looked at him. Why tomorrow specifically? Because the conservator arrives at 9, and because there are things in that room that I want a witness for, someone outside the official process, someone who can understand what they're seeing and carry it correctly. I understood what he was asking, not for a journalist, not for someone with an agenda, for someone who would treat it as it deserved to be treated. I'll be there, I said. The conservator's name was Dr. Patricia Lowell. She arrived in a dark green estate car precisely at 9, which I later understood was characteristic. Patricia was, Edmund had warned me, a person who considered punctuality a form of respect for the work. She was in her late 50s with close-cut silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the hands of someone who has spent a career handling fragile things. Steady, deliberate, unhurried. She greeted Edmund and Calloway with the ease of someone already familiar with the situation. She had been briefed, thoroughly, and she asked no unnecessary questions. She shook my hand and looked at me with the kind of clear assessment that made me feel she'd made a reasonable judgment about me within the first 30 seconds, and was now simply confirming it. You're the researcher, she said. Yes. Good, I find it helps to have someone present who doesn't have a stake in the institutional process. She said it matter-of-factly, without any implied criticism, just an observation. Let's go down. The room felt different with Patricia in it. Not in a bad way. In the way that a room changes when the person in it knows exactly what they're looking at. She moved slowly and deliberately, examining, occasionally making a short note in the small leather book she carried, occasionally asking Calloway a quiet question about the condition in which something had been found or whether anything had been moved. Nothing had been moved, Calloway assured her. He documented the room photographically before touching anything, and the photographs matched what she was now seeing. Patricia paused a long time at the table. She looked at the correspondence first, not reading the letters, just assessing the physical state of them. Paper type, ink condition, signs of moisture or insect damage. She made notes. Then she moved to the small painted portrait. She tilted it toward the light. Once, twice. Her expression didn't change, but something in her focus sharpened. Do you know this subject? She asked me, which surprised me. I'd expected her to direct the question to Edmund. No, I said, not immediately. She set it carefully down. Nor do I definitively, but the style is consistent with formal portraiture from the 1920s or early 1930s. The technique around the eyes particularly will need a specialist opinion. She moved on to the carved box. This time she did stop, properly stop. She pulled on a pair of cotton gloves from her jacket pocket. She'd had them there the whole time, I realized, and hadn't needed to go looking, and lifted the box carefully. Turned it. Examined the base. The hinge. The interior, which she opened with the kind of gentleness that made watching it feel like witnessing something significant. Inside the box were two things. A small brooch, enamel, pale blue and gold, resting in a bed of faded silk. And beneath the silk, a folded piece of paper. Patricia didn't unfold the paper. She looked at it for a moment, then set the box down on the table. The brooch, she said quietly, if preliminary visual assessment is correct, and I stress preliminary, may be consistent with documented pieces from Queen Mary's personal collection. Several items from that collection were considered lost after the 1950s, unaccounted for in any formal inventory. The silence in the room was complete. "And the paper?" Edmund asked. "That," said Patricia, "we open together with proper documentation present, and we do it once. Not today." She said it with such quiet finality that no one argued. I want to tell you about Patricia's manner of working, because it says something important. When she moved through that room, she was not excited. She was not rushing to conclusions. She was not performing the drama of discovery, and there was drama available if she'd wanted it. The discovery of lost royal artifacts, correspondence, personal objects hidden for decades. Any other person might have let the weight of it lift them a little, might have moved a little faster, talked a little more, allowed themselves the satisfaction of visible reaction. Patricia did none of that. She moved with a kind of tenderness that I've only ever seen in people who have genuinely devoted themselves to something beyond their own career. Not the tenderness of sentimentality. The tenderness of someone who understands that the objects in front of them are not hers, have never been hers, will never be hers. They belong to a story larger than any single person in the room, and her job is to make sure they survive into the future intact. There's a discipline in that which I found, honestly, moving. By mid-morning, she had assessed approximately 2/3 of what the room contained. She'd identified, with appropriate qualification, several items that she believed were of significant historical importance. The correspondence, if verified as the late Queen's personal letters, would represent a collection of private communication not previously known to exist. The portrait subject was unknown, but the work itself was of quality that merited specialist attention. The carved box and its contents were the most striking single find. But there was one more thing. Near the far corner of the room, on the lowest shelf, half hidden behind a box of what turned out to be old household inventories, Calloway had mentioned finding something on his initial visit that he hadn't fully processed. He'd flagged it in his notes, but hadn't known what to make of it. Patricia crouched down, moving carefully on the cold stone floor, and reached toward the back of the shelf. She pulled out a flat, rectangular object wrapped in cloth, not acid-free tissue. Old cloth, linen, perhaps, or wool, in a color that had once been dark green and had faded over decades to something softer. She carried it to the table, set it down, looked at it for a moment. "May I?" she said to Calloway. He nodded. She unwrapped it. It was a book. Not a valuable book in the obvious sense, not gilt-edged, not ornate. A plain cloth-bound volume, perhaps an inch thick, its cover a dark color that had faded unevenly. There was no title on the cover, no author, no markings that I could see from where I stood. Patricia opened it. Not to the first page, to somewhere near the middle. She read for a moment, then she looked up. Her expression hadn't changed, not dramatically, but there was something in it, something careful and considered that hadn't been there a moment ago. "This," she said, "appears to be a journal." She didn't read from it, she didn't quote it. She closed it gently and set it flat on the table. "A journal in whose hand?" Edmund asked. "I would need graphological verification," she said. "But the hand, and I've seen it in documented sources, appears consistent with Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Queen Mary's daughter, the late Queen's mother. A journal that had apparently been kept here in this room, in this house. Kept, one assumed, by the daughter of the woman whose brooch also lay in that room." There were several seconds where no one said anything. I was aware in that moment of the sheer accumulated weight of what we were standing in the presence of. Not power, not wealth, not the institutional grandeur that surrounds royal history in its public form. Just the weight of lives. Genuinely lived lives, felt private, human, the kind that don't get written about because they weren't performed for anyone. Calloway, who had barely spoken for the entire morning, said something that I wrote down as soon as I could, because I knew I didn't want to lose it. "All those years of watching," he said, "and this is what was there all along, just people trying to hold on to things that mattered to them, same as anyone." He didn't say it to anyone in particular. He said it to the room. Patricia worked for another 2 hours. When she finally came upstairs, she washed her hands carefully in the kitchen sink, old habit. She said, though she'd been gloved the whole time, and accepted a cup of tea from Calloway, who'd found an old tin of biscuits in one of the kitchen cupboards and set it out without comment. We sat around the kitchen table. 4 people who had spent a morning in the company of something extraordinary. now doing the very ordinary thing of sitting with tea and saying very little. "What happens to the journal?" I asked eventually. Patricia wrapped both hands around her mug. "It goes through proper channels, provenance verification, conservation assessment. It's treated the same as everything else down there." "And the letter in the box?" "Same." "Does it bother you," I asked, "not to read it, to stand that close to something and deliberately not look?" She considered this genuinely. It wasn't an easy question, and she didn't pretend otherwise. "Sometimes," she said. "Yes, I'm human, the curiosity is real." She paused, "but the discipline matters more. If I give myself permission to look because I'm curious, then the object is no longer primary. My curiosity is, and that's the wrong order." She took a sip of tea. "These things survived because someone cared for them in the right order. My job is to make sure they keep surviving. The stories they contain, those belong to someone other than me." I thought about that on the drive back to London. Hours later, sitting in traffic on the road while the October dark came down early the way it always does in England in autumn, I thought about the right order. Who things belong to, who keeps them, and what it means that a woman observed, photographed, documented, analyzed, symbolized, interpreted by millions of people for decades, had kept this small collection of genuinely private things in a house that almost nobody knew existed. Not treasures in the material sense. Not the crowns and the jewels and the robes of state. Just things: a grandmother's brooch in a carved box, her mother's private words in a plain cloth-bound journal, letters in her own handwriting, a pressed flower, a child's drawing on card, a photograph of someone laughing. The kind of things that any person might keep. The kind of things that tell you, more honestly than anything else, what a person actually valued. 3 days later, Edmund called. The preliminary verification was proceeding. The right processes were in motion. The conservator's assessment had been formally submitted. There were people involved now, more people, the institutional kind, the ones who manage things at a level I have no access to, and the process would take the time it needed to take. "And the journal?" I asked. "Being handled carefully," he said. "And the letters?" A pause. "The letter," he said, "has been opened with proper documentation." "What did it say?" Another pause, longer this time. "I can't tell you that." "Edmund." "Not yet," he said, and his voice had a quality I hadn't heard in it before, not official, not procedural, something quieter than that. "But I can tell you," he said, that when Patricia read it, she stopped for a full minute before she said anything. He let that sit. "A minute is a long time," I said. "Yes," he said. "For Patricia especially." "Yes," he said again, "for Patricia especially." Time passes strangely when you're waiting for a story to resolve itself. The weeks after Rayfield House had a kind of suspended quality. I would go about my regular work, sit in my office, answer emails, drink too much coffee, and find myself in the middle of entirely unrelated tasks, thinking about that stone room. The yellowish light, the worn smoothness of the table, the way Calloway had stood very still looking at the journal and said what he'd said about people holding on to things that mattered. It stays with you. Not because it was dramatic, because it was the opposite of dramatic, because underneath all of the public grandeur and ceremonial weight of what the royal family represents, there was this: a woman who kept her grandmother's brooch in a box, and her mother's journal on a shelf, and her own letters in a room where almost nobody would ever look. It stays with you because it's so recognizably human. And that's not something you expect to find at the center of one of history's most observed families. 6 weeks after the initial visit, Edmund called again. "I want you to come with me once more," he said. "Not to the house, somewhere else." He wouldn't say where on the phone. He said it in the way he had of implying that patience was not optional, which I had by now accepted as simply the way Edmund communicated when things were at a delicate stage. I met him on a Wednesday morning, earlier than the first time, just past 7, and still dark in the way that November is dark in England, a darkness that doesn't feel like night exactly, but like a grayness that day never fully overcomes. He drove me to a building I recognized once we were close enough to see it properly, a heritage institution in central London, one of the ones that handles the conservation and storage of historical documents and objects of national significance. Not a museum in the public sense. The kind of place that does the work behind the work. We went in through a side entrance. A woman met us in the corridor. She introduced herself simply as Marion, gave no further detail, and led us through a series of secure doors to a room that was nothing like Rayfield House, but shared with it a quality of careful, focused silence. It was a conservation workroom. Bright, clean, controlled, long tables under precise lighting, the smell of specific chemicals, not harsh but present, the kind of room where everything is done very slowly and very correctly. Patricia was there. She looked the same as she had at the house, same measured stillness, same wire-rimmed glasses, same sense of someone entirely absorbed in what was in front of her. She greeted us without ceremony and led us to one of the tables, where several items were laid out under controlled illumination, with the kind of careful spacing that tells you each object has been given its own considered status. The brooch was there, out of the box now, assessed, documented, resting on a clean mount. Under the controlled light it was, and I hadn't been able to fully register this in the dim stone room, genuinely beautiful. The enamel work was intricate, the pale blue catching the light in that particular way of very old, very fine craftsmanship that no modern reproduction quite achieves. Confirmed, Patricia said simply. Consistent with documented pieces from Queen Mary's personal collection. A cross-reference with historical photographs taken in 1937 at a private engagement, not a formal state occasion, which is why it wasn't previously catalogued. Shows what we believe is this brooch on Queen Mary's lapel. She said it without fanfare. What does that mean practically? I asked. It means it's been found, she said. After 80-plus years of being categorized as simply unaccounted for, not lost, not stolen, just absent from the record, it has now been found. She paused, in the care of the woman who was Queen Mary's granddaughter, who kept it here in her own private space, for reasons that are now a little clearer. Because of the letter, I said. Patricia looked at Edmund. Edmund gave a small nod. Because of the letter, she confirmed. The letter... This is the part of the account that requires the most care, because the letter it remains private. Its full contents were not shared with me, and I would not share them here if they had been. There are things that belong to families and to history that are not mine to relay, and I am conscious of that. But Patricia had agreed with Edmund's involvement to tell me something about what the letter contained, not the words themselves, the shape of it. It was written to be found, Patricia said. That's the first thing to understand. It wasn't a private note in the usual sense. It wasn't written in the moment, spontaneously. It was composed, deliberately, with the knowledge that eventually someone would come down those stairs and open that box. She was speaking carefully. Precisely. The brooch, she continued, was placed there intentionally, with the letter, together. They were meant to be found together. That's clear from the letter's content. What was the letter about? I asked. It was about keeping, she said. About the act of keeping something, what it means to hold on to an object through time. The letter, and I'm giving you the shape, not the content, speaks to the brooch's significance. Not its monetary value, its personal significance. The line of women it had passed through, what it had meant to each of them, and what she, the person who wrote the letter, wanted the person who found it to understand. I sat with that. Which was what? Patricia considered for a moment. That some things are kept not because they're valuable in the ways the world measures value. They're kept because they are a way of holding someone close, of refusing to lose them entirely, of saying, in the only way available to you, that the person who held this before me mattered, and I remember them, and I will not let them disappear. The room was very quiet. And she wanted that known, I said. She wanted it known, Patricia said. Eventually, when the time was right, and perhaps, she added, when the distance of time would let it be understood without the surrounding noise. Calloway came in about 20 minutes later. He'd driven separately, and I hadn't known he would be there. He came in with the same quality of stillness he always carried, accepted a brief acknowledgement from Patricia and Edmund, and stood near the edge of the table. He looked at the brooch for a long time. He'd been the one to find it, first, alone in that room on a day when he'd been expecting filing boxes and outdated administrative records. It had been his hands that had first touched that room in decades, his eyes that had first registered what was there. I wondered what that was like. I think I said something, asked him directly, and he thought about it for a moment before answering. I felt like I'd made a mistake, he said. Not in the sense of doing something wrong, in the sense that I'd gone somewhere I wasn't supposed to have gone. Not by anyone's decision, just by chance, by a filing error from 30 years ago. He paused, and then I thought, well, was it? Was it really just chance? Or is it that these things wait? They hold still and they wait, and eventually the right moment comes. He looked at the brooch again. She'd placed it there for a reason. She'd written the letter. She'd made a decision at some point in her life that this would be found and understood. Maybe not in her lifetime, but eventually. He straightened slightly. I felt in the end that I hadn't made a mistake at all, that I'd arrived at the right place at the right time, and that my job was simply to handle it correctly. He said that last sentence with a kind of quiet dignity that I've been thinking about ever since. My job was simply to handle it correctly. There is a particular quality to the end of a story that has been building for a very long time. Not an ending that wraps up cleanly, life rarely produces those, but an ending that brings something into the light that was always there, waiting, and allows it to be properly seen for the first time. The objects from Rayfield House would go, eventually, through proper channels. The verified items would be documented, assessed, placed appropriately within institutional care. Some, over time, might be displayed, exhibited in a context where the public could understand their significance, the story they carry, the lives they connect. The journal would be studied by the appropriate scholars. The correspondence would be verified, and in time, placed in the care of those who manage such things correctly. The brooch, Queen Mary's brooch, kept by her granddaughter for decades in a quiet stone room, would find its place in the record. Known, finally, accounted for, no longer absent. And the letter that was written to be found, that explained why these things had been kept, and what they meant, and what the person who kept them wanted the world, eventually, to understand. The letter would take its own careful path through the right process. Its words were not mine to know fully. Perhaps not yet anyone's, beyond the small circle of careful people who had opened it correctly, in the right order, in a room designed for exactly that kind of work. But its shape was clear. Someone had loved, had lost, had held on through the only means available to the people she had loved, had done so privately without asking for recognition, without performing the emotion for any audience, and had trusted in the end that when the right moment came, someone would find it and understand. I went back to Rayfield House once more by myself, a few weeks later. Not officially. I drove out on a Saturday morning when the sky was doing that thing it does in late November, low and white and completely still, like the whole world was holding its breath. The gate was locked, of course. I didn't go in. I just stood at the pillars and looked at the front of the house. The wisteria on the east wall had lost every leaf. Its bare branches made a pattern against the stone that was actually more detailed than I'd noticed before, more intricate, more deliberate in its spread. The way bare trees and bare vines always reveal structure that summer hides. I stood there for a while. A bird went over, a crow, I think, or a jackdaw, calling once and then gone. I thought about all of it, the stone room and the table and the light. Patricia's gloved hands opening the carved box with the patience of someone who understands that some moments are not to be rushed. Calloway standing very still in the conservator's room, looking at the brooch that he'd found first in the dark, on a day when he'd been expecting nothing important. I thought about the pressed flowers and the child's drawing, and the photograph of someone laughing. I thought about what it means to keep something, to carry something through time, to refuse to let it disappear. And I thought that this, all of this, was its own kind of treasure. Not the kind with a market value. Not the kind that makes the news in the usual way, with the usual breathless language about auction estimates and historical significance and museum acquisitions. This other kind, the kind that a person makes when they say, "This mattered to someone I loved, and I will not let it be lost, and I will trust that someone eventually will understand why." Edmund called me once more, some months after. "The process is moving well," he said. "Everything's where it should be." "Good," I said. "You're writing this up." "Yes, carefully." "That's all I ask," he said. There was a brief silence. "Edmund," I said, "the minute." When Patricia read the letter and stopped for a minute before she said anything, what did she say when she finally spoke? He was quiet for a moment. I half expected him to say he couldn't tell me, or that it wasn't for him to relay. But he didn't. She said she knew someone would come. She always knew someone would come. I held the phone for a long time after he rang off. Outside my window, London was doing what London does: traffic and noise and the pressing on of ordinary life, indifferent to the quiet things that have always existed underneath it. But I kept hearing Patricia's words. She knew someone would come. That is, in the end, the deepest act of trust a person can perform. Not trust in a specific person, or a specific time, or a specific outcome. Trust that if something is placed in the world with enough care, with enough love, with enough intention, eventually, in its own time, it will be found. And when it is found, it will be held correctly. It will be carried forward. It will not be lost. Some discoveries don't shake the earth. They don't make the front page in the way explosions make the front page. They don't carry the immediate drama that the world's attention requires. But they carry something else. They carry the weight of a life honestly lived, of a love that didn't need an audience, of a choice made quietly, privately, in a room where almost nobody would ever look, to hold on to what mattered and to trust the future with it. That is its own kind of extraordinary. That is, I think, the truest thing I can say about what was found in that room. Not the brooch, and not the journal, and not the letter, but what those things meant, and what it means that someone kept them.